the last point that I want to make about this whole TPP thing, and this is really, I think, the largest point. I probably should have opened the program with this, but the biggest point here is an issue of sovereignty. Are we the United States of America, or are we part of some sort of world government? Now, this was a huge issue back in the 1920s when Woodrow Wilson was pushing us to join the League of Nations. And the Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, and the Republicans said no, and they defeated him. And then after World War II, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, this was what led to the creation of the United Nations, was basically World War II. Let's not have a war anymore. The United Nations, by treaty, basically only has authority over issues of war and peace. That's what it was created for. It's just prevent another world war. And so if we go to war, unless we were attacked, if we go to war, we're in violation of international treaties. And as George W. Bush, when he invaded Iraq, he was in violation of international law. He was a war criminal for doing that. 6 months later, we went to the United Nations and said, will you retroactively legalize what George Bush did illegally? And the UN voted to do so. But that was it. But I remember back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s even, arguing with my father, where he was like, the UN is the beginning of the end of American sovereignty. We gave up our military ability, our ability to simply, drop bombs on somebody without the permission of the UN. What's next? And I was like, well, I don't think the UN is that big a deal. And he was very concerned about it. Well, it turns out the UN isn't that big a deal. But where are those conservatives who back in the 60s and 70s were hysterical about the United Nations, the John Boltons of the world, saying the United States is surrendering its sovereignty. We are turning control of our nation over to an international body that is not elected and that doesn't represent the best interests of the United States. That's exactly what these trade deals are. NAFTA, CAFTA, Korean Free Trade Deal, the WTO, and now the TPP, all of them, every single one of them creates another corporate-run international entity that adjudicates trade disputes, that basically becomes the law of the land and becomes the courts, the judge, the jury, the executioner, the whole thing. We are surrendering our sovereignty. I'm giving you the rant right now that Republicans and conservatives were laying out against the UN back in the 60s and the 50s and the 70s. And well, frankly, to this day, I mean, John Bolton, back when George Bush was president, said if they blew off the top 10 floors of the UN, it would be just fine with him. So what did George W. Bush do? He made him UN ambassador. So there's this deep strain of kind of nativism within the conservative movement that says America first. And I'm actually making that argument. Here I am making a conservative argument for the United States. Now, frankly, I think this is also a progressive argument. I don't, because progressives, historically, Americans always said America first. We didn't say, well, yeah, let's impoverish Cleveland so that we can raise the standard of living of people in Bangladesh. Let's shut down all those textile mills in downtown Baltimore. Baltimore used to make all kinds of clothing. Even more than that, Manchester, New Hampshire. I used to live in New Hampshire. And what's the river? Winooski? Whatever the river is that runs right through the middle of Manchester, New Hampshire. And all along that riverfront were all these textile mills that ran on water power. They'd stick a water wheel out in the river and take that motive force. They would generate electricity, but they would also just take it as raw energy and to turn the gears on the machines that were used to make clothing. And we don't make those clothes in the United States anymore. And I find it bizarre that somebody would say, well, let's shut down all those clothing factories in Baltimore and let's let the inner city just rot in order to raise the standard of living of 13-year-olds in Bangladesh who need to work to support their families by making textiles, by making clothing for us, and being paid 20 cents an hour to do it. Let Bangladesh develop its own industry. Let them do what we did. Every country in the world should be doing this. They should be looking at what Alexander Hamilton stole from Henry VII, or Henry V, 6th, I think it was the 7th, the Tudor plan, who stole it from the Dutch in the 1500s, the 1400s, who stole it from the Greeks 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, the Romans 2,000 years ago, the Greeks 3,000 years ago. This is not a new idea, that a country should engage in economic policies that benefit the country itself. Not a new idea. We'll be back.